Patton believed victory was being stolen right in front of him, not by the enemy, but by his own commander. And what followed still divides historians today. The moment General Patton stood at the edge of victory, history quietly changed direction. The war in Europe was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. German resistance was breaking, morale was shattered, and Allied forces were advancing at a speed that stunned even their own commanders. At the center of this momentum stood Patton, relentless, aggressive, and convinced that the war could be ended not just decisively, but permanently. And yet, at the very moment when his instincts told him to push harder, go faster, and strike deeper, the order came down from above. Stop. For Patton, that word carried more weight than any enemy fire he had ever faced. Patton had always believed that war rewarded boldness. From North Africa through France, his philosophy had remained unchanged. Speed saves lives, hesitation costs them. Every mile gained without pause meant fewer soldiers dying tomorrow. His Third Army became the embodiment of this belief, racing across Europe with a ferocity that left German commanders scrambling and Allied leaders both impressed and uneasy. To Patton, the collapse of Nazi Germany was not a slow erosion. It was a door blown open, and he believed the only mistake left was failing to walk through it fast enough. Dwight D. Eisenhower saw the same battlefield, but through a very different lens. As Supreme Allied Commander, Eisenhower was not responsible only for winning battles. He was responsible for holding together a fragile coalition of nations, political promises, and post-war plans that extended far beyond Patton's armored columns. Where Patton saw opportunity, Eisenhower saw risk. Where Patton saw momentum, Eisenhower saw potential chaos. Their conflict was not about courage versus fear, but about two fundamentally different definitions of victory. As Patton's forces surged forward, they began to outpace supply lines, stretch coordination, and raise uncomfortable questions among Allied leadership. The faster Patton moved, the harder it became to control the broader strategy. Eisenhower worried not just about German resistance, but about accidental clashes with Soviet forces, diplomatic fallout, and the perception of Allied unity. The war was nearing its end, and Eisenhower believed that how it ended mattered just as much as ending it. Patton, however, believed that endings written in caution often led to unfinished business. He had studied history deeply and believed that wars left unresolved always returned in new forms. To him, stopping short of total domination was an invitation for future conflict. He did not trust political agreements to secure peace where military strength could. Every time Patton looked at the maps, he saw not borders and agreements, but momentum bleeding away with each pause. The decision to restrain Patton was not sudden. It was the result of mounting concerns within Allied command. Patton's aggressive advance threatened to disrupt coordinated plans, draw resources away from other fronts, and undermine agreements already made between Allied leaders. Eisenhower understood that Patton's style, while effective tactically, could become destabilizing strategically. The closer victory came, the more Eisenhower felt the need to tighten control, not loosen it. When Eisenhower issued orders that slowed Patton's advance, it felt to Patton like betrayal. Not personal betrayal, but betrayal of battlefield logic. Patton believed his army was being punished for success. He believed that his momentum was being sacrificed to preserve appearances and political comfort. To a man who measured success in ground taken and enemies broken, being told to wait felt like watching victory slip through open fingers. This was not the first time Eisenhower had restrained Patton, and that history weighed heavily on both men. Earlier humiliations, disciplinary actions, and sidelining had taught Patton that brilliance alone did not guarantee freedom of action. Eisenhower had learned, painfully, that Patton's strengths came packaged with risks he could not ignore. Their relationship was defined by mutual respect layered over deep mistrust. Eisenhower admired Patton's battlefield genius. Patton respected Eisenhower's authority, but neither fully trusted the other's instincts. At the edge of victory, Eisenhower made a choice that would define his legacy. He chose control over speed, unity over dominance, and long-term stability over short-term triumph. He believed that an uncontrolled rush forward could fracture the alliance, provoke unintended conflict, and undermine the very peace the Allies were fighting to secure. To Eisenhower, stopping Patton was not about limiting victory. It was about shaping it. To Patton, that explanation rang hollow. He believed that peace enforced by strength was the only peace that lasted. He feared that hesitation at the final hour would plant the seeds of future wars. In private, he questioned whether leaders, who had not lived in the chaos of rapid combat, could truly understand its opportunities. He believed that politicians and planners underestimated how rare such moments of collapse truly were. The emotional weight of being stopped at the edge of victory cut deeper than any previous restraint. Patton had accepted discipline before. He had endured humiliation. But this felt different. This felt like history itself being redirected against his will. He felt that his army, his soldiers, had earned the right to finish what they started, without breaks applied from distant headquarters. Yet Patton did not disobey. His loyalty to the chain of command remained intact, even as frustration burned beneath the surface. That obedience came at a personal cost. The tension between his instincts and his orders created a silence within him that few ever saw. He carried the knowledge that he could advance, that he could change the ending, but that he was forbidden to try. As the war's end approached, the question lingered unspoken but unresolved. Did Eisenhower stop Patton because he was reckless, or because Patton was too effective to be left unchecked? Was this restraint an act of wisdom, or a failure of nerve at the moment when boldness mattered most? The answer would not reveal itself immediately. It would take years. Borders drawn, alliances broken, and new conflicts born from old compromises. And in that delay, the true meaning of Eisenhower's decision and Patton's frustration would slowly come into focus. This was only the beginning of that story. As the Allied armies pushed deeper into Germany, the tension between momentum and restraint became impossible to ignore. Patton's Third Army was moving with astonishing speed, capturing towns, breaking enemy lines, and taking prisoners faster than headquarters could process reports. To Patton, this was proof that the enemy was finished in spirit, if not yet on paper. Every successful advance reinforced his belief that stopping now would be the gravest mistake of the war. He believed the collapse of Germany was not something to manage carefully, but something to exploit mercilessly, before it could harden into resistance or transform into something worse. From Eisenhower's perspective, however, Patton's speed was becoming a problem rather than a triumph. Supply lines were stretched thin. Coordination between Allied armies was increasingly complex, and the risk of chaos grew with every mile Patton advanced ahead of the plan. Eisenhower was responsible not only for Patton's army, but for the entire Allied force, including British, Canadian, and other units whose cooperation depended on trust and balance. Allowing one commander to surge too far ahead threatened that balance. Eisenhower feared that victory achieved through disorder could fracture the alliance at the very moment unity was most needed. There was also the shadow of politics, something Patton despised but Eisenhower could not ignore. Agreements had already been made about zones of occupation, lines of advance, and post-war control. These were not abstract promises. They were commitments between world leaders whose consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. Eisenhower understood that ignoring these agreements in pursuit of tactical advantage could unravel the fragile consensus holding the Allies together. To Patton, these concerns felt distant and artificial. To Eisenhower, they were the foundation of the peace that would follow the war. Another fear weighed heavily on Eisenhower's mind: the possibility of unintended confrontation with Soviet forces. As Allied and Soviet armies closed in from opposite directions, the risk of confusion, miscommunication, or accidental clashes increased. Eisenhower knew that one wrong move, one misunderstood advance, could ignite a new conflict before the current one had even ended. Patton, however, believed this fear was exaggerated. He felt the Soviets respected strength and decisiveness, and that hesitation only invited pressure. To him, clear dominance would prevent conflict, not provoke it. Patton's frustration grew as he sensed his freedom slipping away. Orders became more restrictive. Advances required more approval. The momentum he cherished was slowly being contained within tighter boundaries. He felt like a sprinter being told to slow down just before the finish line. In private, he questioned whether Eisenhower truly trusted him, or whether past controversies had permanently marked him as a risk rather than an asset. The memory of earlier humiliations resurfaced, reminding Patton that his instincts, no matter how often they proved correct, were always viewed with suspicion. Eisenhower, meanwhile, wrestled with his own doubts. He knew Patton was winning. He knew that few commanders could match Patton's ability to exploit enemy collapse. But Eisenhower also knew that Patton did not see the entire picture, because no single battlefield commander could. Eisenhower carried the burden of millions of lives, international stability, and a future that demanded restraint even in victory. Stopping Patton was not an act of personal judgment, but a decision shaped by responsibilities Patton had never wanted and never sought. As the days passed, Patton's words grew heavier, more reflective. He spoke less of immediate action and more of missed opportunities. He believed that history rarely offered such moments of total enemy collapse, and that failing to seize them fully always led to regret. He worried that stopping short would allow new divisions to form, new resentments to grow, and new conflicts to emerge from the ashes of the old. To Patton, the war was not just about defeating Germany, but about preventing the conditions that allowed such a war to exist. In the first place, the emotional distance between the two generals widened. Eisenhower respected Patton's obedience, but remained firm in his decisions. Patton respected Eisenhower's authority, but felt increasingly disconnected from the strategy guiding the war's end. They were no longer arguing about tactics. They were embodying two philosophies of leadership. One believed that control ensured stability. The other believed that momentum ensured finality. Neither could fully convince the other, because both were shaped by different fears. Patton's soldiers sensed his frustration, even if they did not fully understand its source. They had followed him through relentless advances and shared his belief that speed meant survival. Being told to pause, to wait, to hold positions when the enemy seemed broken felt unnatural. Patton carried their unspoken questions with him, knowing that obedience was necessary, but also knowing that hesitation carried its own risks. The weight of command pressed heavily on him, not because he doubted his ability to fight, but because he doubted the direction of the fight itself. As victory drew closer, the question that haunted Patton became clearer. Was Eisenhower stopping him to prevent disaster, or to control him? Was restraint truly protecting the future, or was it planting the seeds of a different kind of conflict? Patton could not answer these questions with certainty, and that uncertainty troubled him more than any enemy resistance ever had. The war was ending, but the consequences of how it ended were only beginning to take shape. Patton felt it instinctively, like a storm building beyond the horizon. And as he stood restrained at the edge of victory, he could not shake the feeling that history was slipping into a path that would one day demand explanations no one would want to give. That reckoning would come later, in ways neither man could fully foresee, bringing the story toward its final and most reflective chapter. As the war in Europe finally came to its official end, Patton stood surrounded by victory, yet weighed down by unease. The enemy had surrendered, the flags had changed, and the guns had fallen silent. But the sense of completion he had expected never arrived. For Patton, stopping short of total resolution felt like leaving a wound bandaged but untreated. He believed the final phase of the war should have been swift, overwhelming, and unmistakable, not measured and restrained. The fact that he had been ordered to slow, to wait, and to hold back remained a heavy presence in his thoughts. In the weeks that followed, Eisenhower's reasoning became clearer to those who looked beyond the battlefield. Europe was exhausted, its cities in ruins, its people desperate for stability rather than continued destruction. Eisenhower understood that the responsibility of victory was now as dangerous as the responsibility of war. One misstep, one aggressive move too far, could fracture the alliance or ignite a new conflict with former partners. Eisenhower believed that leadership required knowing when to stop just as much as knowing when to advance. In his mind, restraining Patton was not denying victory, but protecting peace. Patton struggled to accept this view. He believed peace secured through caution was fragile, dependent on promises rather than strength. He feared that unresolved power struggles would resurface in new forms, fueled by the compromises made in the war's final days. In his private reflections, Patton expressed the belief that wars ended decisively only when one side fully imposed its will. Anything less, he thought, allowed history to repeat itself under different banners. His concern was not conquest, but closure. Despite these differences, Patton did not turn his frustration into defiance. He obeyed orders, maintained discipline, and continued to lead with professionalism. That obedience, however, came at an emotional cost. He felt like a man who had been asked to silence his instincts at the very moment they felt most validated. The tension between what he believed should have been done and what was done lingered within him, unresolved and heavy. Eisenhower, for his part, carried the burden of his decision quietly. He knew that restraining Patton meant absorbing criticism, doubt, and second-guessing from those who believed victory should have been pursued without limits. Yet Eisenhower remained convinced that restraint had prevented chaos, not caused it. He believed the war's end required balance, patience, and foresight more than raw momentum. History, he hoped, would understand that his decision was not about fear, but responsibility. As time passed, the consequences of stopping Patton became clearer in ways both men had anticipated differently. Europe divided along ideological lines. Tensions hardened into standoffs. New alliances formed in response to old compromises. To some, these outcomes validated Patton's warnings. To others, they proved that Eisenhower's caution had prevented immediate catastrophe. The truth lay somewhere between, shaped by forces larger than any single decision. Patton did not live long enough to see how fully the world would change. His sudden death shortly after the war ended froze his legacy in the image of the warrior, brilliant, relentless, and forever at odds with restraint. Eisenhower moved on to a different role, one that demanded the same caution he had shown at the war's end. His leadership would be defined by preventing conflict rather than pursuing it, by balance rather than aggression. In the end, the question of why Eisenhower stopped Patton at the edge of victory has no simple answer. It was not because Patton lacked skill or courage. It was not because Eisenhower feared success. It was because victory meant different things to each man. To Patton, victory was finality, dominance, and the elimination of future threats through decisive action. To Eisenhower, victory was stability, unity, and the careful construction of a peace that could endure. Their conflict reveals a deeper truth about leadership in moments of triumph. Winning a war is not the same as winning the future. The qualities that bring victory on the battlefield are not always the same ones that preserve peace afterward. Eisenhower stopped Patton not to deny his brilliance, but to contain it within a vision of victory that extended beyond the battlefield. History continues to debate who was right, but perhaps the greater lesson lies not in choosing sides, but in understanding that great outcomes are often born from tension between opposing truths. Patton's drive and Eisenhower's restraint together shaped the end of the war and the world that followed. And at the edge of victory, where one man wanted to charge forward and the other chose to hold the line, history took a path that still defines our present.